Hi, everyone, and welcome to another discussion in our Black Lives Matter series. The book that we are going to be talking about today is Indigo by Beverly Jenkins. This is a historical romance that was written in 1996. And before we get started, let's just quickly go around and introduce ourselves. My name's Lucy. I'm a library technician in the youth department at Ann Arbor District Library.
My name's Audrey. I am a librarian and I work primarily in adult services.
My name's Krista and I'm a library desk clerk at the Ann Arbor District Library.
And my name is Elizabeth and I am a librarian in both youth and adult services at AADL.
All right. So I guess before we jump into the book, does anyone want to give a brief synopsis of it, just to set the period that we're talking in about?
I can do that.
Sure.
So I'll try to be super brief. Basically, this is set in pre-Civil War Michigan, actually. Right? Am I crazy?
Yeah. No, it is.
Okay. It's set in pre-Civil War Michigan and centers on a woman who helps facilitate escaped enslaved people through the Underground Railroad. She runs a stop on the railroad, and the book opens with a very kind of prominent escaped enslaved person referred to as the Black Daniel, who comes through. He's severely injured. The first part of the book is kind of tending to him and a lot of historical information about the Underground Railroad and all that. And then as the book progresses, they develop some strong feelings for each other. And there's certainly a very large romance element along with more kind of coverage of historical events from that time period. So I guess that's how I would quickly summarize it.
Yeah, no, I think that sounds great. And what were your first impressions of the book, or your impressions in general? What did you think of the book?
When I first got it, I thought, wow, this is long for a romance. But there's so much more going on. It really is very historical. She clearly did her research. And I know she's from Belleville, so she knows the area. And I really liked that because she would mention going into Ann Arbor and going to the post office and going to the train station, where I've been to the train station. So I really liked those elements.
Yeah, I thought it was fun to read about this kind of heavy historical thing in a romantic context, in a way where you were getting a lot of information, but also the focus is really on the romance. And yeah, it was interesting because I feel like romances are kind of a fantasy. So you always knew everything was going to turn out right in the end, more or less, which is obviously not necessarily how real life would have worked. But some knowledge of how things usually would have gone did make the character it made the danger feel a little bit more present than it might have if the characters were in a different situation.
Yeah, I really appreciated the historical details as well. I just felt like they added to the book a lot. Not that there's anything wrong with just a straightforward romance. That's great fun often. But for a book, especially of this length, it is pretty long. I'm just pulling mine up now, 400 pages. I really liked that it was, I felt like I actually did kind of learn a little bit just about, the area and the time period, and just kind of maybe a blip. I mean, I know about the Underground Railroad, but just some of the details were really vivid, and I liked that. As I especially right off the bat, I was excited to see that was the case. And it was I thought the writing, I was impressed with. I knew Beverly Jenkins is a very famous writer, but I hadn't read her before, so I thought that the writing was quite good, and I was really pleased with that, because again, not to rag on romances, but sometimes they can be more just kind of fluffy, and I was impressed with the writing style.
Yeah, I would agree with what everyone said. I really liked the historical aspect, but like you were saying, Audrey, I think it was nice to have this lighter side of the romance. And I also appreciated getting this piece of history from a different point of view, and also a book that is about enslaved people. It's a slave narrative in a way, but it's not full of trauma. That's not what we're there to sort of dig through. And instead it's like, these people also created schools, and they also fell in love, and they also did all these other things. And I really like that part of it. It's Since I've finished it, I feel like I've done a lot of reading about it and watching interviews with Beverly Jenkins and looking up historical stuff. And the more I do that, it's like the more and more I actually really like and appreciate this book. And I realized that I think the characters were well done, and they're gonna stick with me. So I liked that you kind of got both the history and the romance. Yeah, and I think that, I think in a way you could say this book is sort of like, it feels like two separate novels. There's the history and the romance. But talking about the history part, one thing I think is interesting, and I wanted to know your thoughts on this, is that like when you're reading historical fiction, you have to consider three things about it really with this book. Like, when does it take place? When was it written? And when are you reading it? And I wondered if any of you thought about that dynamic in Indigo, or saw where it played out in Indigo.
I think that is a really great question. So thanks, Lucy. I was thinking about that right when I started, because this was written in 1996, and that is, going on 30 years ago. And I think that there has been a lot of thought and, just research and all that, and even just a simple terminology with the ways that we might refer to enslaved people, or the ways that we might think about this time period. So I was interested to see like how kind of modern thought was, like how it came through in the book or not. And I guess I don't have a ton, like there was nothing that stood out to me as like, oh, this seems so dated in the way that this is described. So I was actually pretty impressed personally with the way things were handled, and the research that it seems like Jenkins had done. But that's just me. So I'd be curious to hear what other people have to say.
I kind of enjoyed the like cameos, so to speak, of historical figures, because I recognized them and I knew what was coming, just being from this time period now. So like having John Brown pop up, it's like, oh. And then of course that incident did occur at the end. So that was kind of fun in a way. It was like seeing celebrity cameos.
Yeah, I thought I was also impressed just in terms of like, I mean, I think she's a good writer, so she brought a lot of humanity to her characters. And I think it really speaks to how much research she probably did to like have such a firm grounding in history, where it felt very like part of the story in a way that I really appreciated. Like this, I was just thinking it really is one of those like spoonful of sugar sorts of things where you get so much history in it, but it is like fun to read because it's a romance. I almost said rom-com, and that's not correct. But I think the place where I noticed it being dated was almost more in some of the like romance tropes, or like the like relationships between like the male female relationships that were happening in it, more than like the way that like enslaved people were presented or anything, because I think she did a good job at presenting them as like full characters and like full people. But also I am who I am, so I have my own limitations and blind spots. So
No, I agree, Audrey. I found that like if anything seemed like dated or stood out to me that like made me, just think again about the time the book was written. It was like this style of the romance writing, which was honestly kind of charming in some ways, although, in other ways there were some things where I was like, well, I mean, anyway, we can get into that later. I know that's something we're talking about right now, but I just wanted to comment that I agree that some of the like romance scenes, I could tell I was like, this is a mid-90s romance scene.
Yeah, I definitely got that too. But then I was thinking about it, like when she wrote this in 1996, there were not a lot of romance novels that were featuring Black characters centrally, and also just as fully fleshed people who were doing all the things. I mean, to even have them, I think with her first books, like to even have Black people on the cover was a fight, and I think now you do see more people of color coming up in romance novels, but I had to appreciate how groundbreaking this must have been in a way. And I know that like Beverly Jenkins is considered sort of the queen of romance, especially historical romance. And so I was reminding myself of that when I was coming across some of the stuff that seemed sort of dated. And then like to learn about that or to read about that period in history placed in a place like you were saying, Krista, where we are now, I thought was really interesting. And I think you can still see a lot of it, like if you go to Detroit and there's like an Underground Railroad tour in Ann Arbor. So I thought it was interesting to be sitting here today and reading about this place at that time. Did you I think we were probably all familiar with that part of history, but did you learn more about it from reading this, or did you learn anything new that struck you as very interesting historically?
I definitely did, because I'm from Michigan, but I'm not from this part of Michigan, so I'm not as familiar with its history. I'm familiar with Kalamazoo and Battle Creek and Marshall being part of the Underground Railroad, but I really didn't know about Ann Arbor, Ypsilanti, didn't know anything about Detroit. So that for me was particularly interesting because it was almost like filling in the map of Michigan in a way. So that I particularly enjoyed.
Yeah, I feel like there's so much written about the actual Civil War, and there's a lot, of course, written about the Underground Railroad, but I think sometimes I think this is set in like the 1830s, maybe. Is that?
Well, I think it's 1858 because at the end
she
it
says
1859.
Okay. I think there's something at some point in the book that mentions like how long though that the like Underground Railroad had been like kind of start like operating, and that is something that I didn't really think about. I can't remember. There's something about like years or something, and I was like, oh right, like this was operating for like many years before the Civil War happened, which is something that I don't think about often. And I was like, oh right, this was a years and years of this, growing and expanding, and stops, locations changing, and increasing. And I found that just kind of interesting to think about over the course of the book, and how many different places they reference in Michigan as places people might go. I guess I hadn't thought previously just both how long the Underground Railroad kind of ran, and also how many people worked to put it together and make it, hopefully make it work to help enslaved people get freedom,
Yeah, I also think that I don't know that I necessarily learned like a specific new fact that I can point to, but I think the way that like reading about kind of, it's not exactly obviously like the daily life of an Underground Railroad person, because this is a romance. Some of the stuff is kind of like a bit of a fantasy, but like there were elements of that like day to day, just like all the thing, like just how it worked, and like what it would be like to like have the life where like that's what like a big thing that you do, that like history books don't really convey, right? So I thought that was interesting, and I found that to be interesting and valuable. And Yeah, particularly
would,
the danger too, I think.
Yeah, I agree. Like right at the beginning, there's the scene where the people looking for Black Daniel are like banging on the door, and the ladies are all like ready with their like cross stitch. They just like switch right over, and I was like, oh, of course they would have that. Like they would be ready, and I just was like, but in like 2 minutes, they're just like, you know, knitting or doing whatever, and like looking up, like, why are you interrupting our like ladies' evening? And I was like, think about how much like acting that would take. Like that's just like I knew that happened, but I think the book did give me like a day-to-day more like kind of like, oh wow, yeah, that must have been really stressful. And also you had to like think of everything and be ready, you know?
I think the other thing that really struck me was like the concept of the traitor, like within the like context of a romance novel. I was like, I spotted you, like as soon as they showed up. But like in the context of like Hester's life, where like these are people that like all of the people that like would theoretically be suspects were like people that she had worked with and like done this work that's like, you know, life or death, right? Like for years, like the idea of a traitor being like so like her just being unwilling to like consider it, like was it initially something that I was like, this is silly and felt a little like plot driven, but the more I thought about it, the more I was like, no, like this woman has like trusted these people with her life for years, literally years, like her whole life. So like of course the idea that like one of them was a traitor would be like, no, absolutely not. So that was another detail that popped out to me, and how devastating that would be too.
yeah, that's really interesting to think about that actually, because I think like there is such an obvious evil for them in this book, and such a obvious enemy. So it does make sense that you would be focusing on that and all these like the workings around, you know, saving people, and like you were saying, Elizabeth, having to cover up really quickly, that to spend time thinking about like which one of the people that's been doing this very thing with me would have been the traitor, just might not even have come to light. Also, Hester was like a really interesting character, I thought, in that she was very worldly and like stood up for herself and what she believed in as far as what she was doing with the Underground Railroad. But when it came to like matters of the heart, she was very strangely naive. And I just thought that was an interesting, like an interesting way to split a character. And I don't know if anyone else thought about that too much, or just.
Yeah, that was interesting. Because there's a lot of emphasis continuously throughout the book of how naive she is in like adult matters. And I mean, I guess if you're raised without that being a part of your life, I mean, she was raised by a spinster aunt, she just never really considered it. But that is kind of interesting that she never questioned it, had questions.
Yeah. I thought about that a lot, because I found that at first like pretty frustrating. I was like, this is this like capable, like kind of like badass lady that's like running the Underground Railroad, and like now she's like, oh, like, but I think, and I also was like, okay, she has these like ladies like knitting things, like don't they talk about stuff like even in like the 1850s they had to have like talked about things. But then again, I was thinking, like, I don't know, it was a different time. Like, I don't think that kind of stuff was like, and like, she hasn't had any personal experience. So, like, you know, and like you said, Krista, like a spinster aunt who maybe was like very reluctant to like really talk about anything related to, as Lucy said, matters of the heart, you know? So I did find myself like frustrated, but also maybe being like, well, maybe this is not as improbable as it like seemed in my mind. I don't know.
I kind of read it as like that romance trope of the like naive, headstrong person, if that makes sense. Which maybe, I don't know, that just is what it reminded me of. And I'll give her credit for at least like going and finding, like she talks to B, I think, about like what all actually happens, like, which reminded me of like it just was like a very stark contrast from like Bridgerton, right, where there's just like no talk at all about that. But it did I don't know, it seemed a little like romance tropey to me, of the like, I'm headstrong, but I've never been in love and I never will be.
Yeah, and I think like I don't read a lot of romance, and so but I do think like that tropes are important. I mean, in romance fiction, and they show up, and like for people who, if you're reading a lot of romance, you might expect to be able to identify some of those. Another part that I kind of struggled with, I have to say, with the romantic issues and Hester's naivete was also like Galen is like so in love with her and her mind and everything, but he also doesn't he has a strange way of possessing her. Like he does not hear no. He sneaks into her room at night and watches her sleep. And it's like
when that happens.
Yeah. And that was one of my times I had to remind myself, like, this is me reacting now. Like I don't know. And even like his insistence on calling her Indigo, it struck me as really interesting when she's like, my name is Hester. And he's like, well, not to me, it's not. I'm calling you Indigo, especially when she's in a time and a place where like people have been given names and told what they are called, and names are changed. And so I just thought that was, I don't know, really interesting. And I'm interested to hear that you screamed, Audrey. I want to know what other people thought about that. Some of those moments.
That exact moment was just like also so disconcerting because it was like a new paragraph break, like Galen is watching her, and I literally was like, what's happening? Like what, where did he come from? Like, because they explain it farther down. It also was just surprising because that happens in Twilight too. Really specifically was the thing it made me think of. So I don't know if it's like a romance genre trope of its own right. But mostly I was like, what is he doing? Because it is her house, and that's I don't know, I was like, that's creepy, like I guess, and like probably part of that's somewhat like a modern take on it, right? But yeah, it seems to some extent to be a book that is like in some ways limited, I think, by being a romance that was written in like 1996. Because I do wonder how much like what it makes me wonder what like publishing this book looked like what the editing process was and stuff like that. Because you talked about this being like, you know, really groundbreaking, but also in some ways it's certainly like of its time too.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think we were supposed to see him watching her sleep as sweet, because it is in other things like Twilight. I immediately thought of Twilight and how creepy that is. But yeah, it is supposed to be seen as like he's being sweet, and that was his one way of, I guess, having something over her, because she is so smart and strong, that was one thing he had that she didn't.
And I do like, it made me wish that I did read a bit more like modern romances, or at least romances written today. And because I just don't know, like maybe that is something, as Audrey said, that like maybe that's a thing that like is in romances sometimes, where like people watch people sleep, and it's like, I don't know, but it did seem very much a product of the time that the book was written, where like that kind of thing wasn't as like publicly talked about as like uncomfortable, you know. Or I think your point, Lucy, about like already enslaved people were like given names and like told, well, you're going to be called this. And so to like do that again almost seems like it's already kind of weird if someone says this is my name and someone else is like, well, no, I'm going to call you this. But I thought that was like almost, but I think again, like I would just wonder how, if that would still happen in like romances written today. And I don't know, because I'm not a huge romance reader. So I don't know, but I thought it, you know, it's a product of its time, as all books are to a certain extent. So
Yeah, I'm not a huge romance reader either, but I do have the distinct impression that like male possessiveness of like the romantic lead is like is a trope, and or like a very common trope, which like I could be wrong. It, you know, I'm a product of my time, but yeah, there were just some things that seemed very romance and of its time. And yeah, it made me wonder how they might be portrayed now, like you said.
Yeah, I did want to know too what you thought about like the idea that the ways that masculinity and femininity were portrayed in this book, like within, you know, like a relationship balance, but also just in general, what you saw different ways of that being shown to indicate different things. I don't know if anyone had thoughts about that.
There was one thing that stuck out to me because she'll say things like all of the things that made her woman and all of the things that made him man. And I was like, that's a little dated.
Yeah. Yeah, but she just had this one part where she's like, because I was just like, she's saying something to Galen. She's like, I don't know where you're from originally, Galen, but on the road here, we women don't always have the luxury of worrying about our reputations when there's work to be done. I did like that little part where she was like, we're actually doing stuff, you know, and not like, so she's disputing this idea of women like sitting around just chatting, and I thought that was interesting. But yeah, I feel like you were saying, Krista, they were very distinct, you know.
Yeah, I
ideas.
felt like there was a real tension between like a lot of the like particularly like the part where the romance came in was where I started noticing more of the like rigid or like people like specifically Hester and Galen being portrayed in particular ways, because outside of the romance you have like Hester, who's very like obviously very capable and like intelligent and like headstrong in a way, but you also had like B, who was like a doctor, and in the one scene where the one female woman is being kept in the sheriff's jail or cell or whatever, and they like break her out, that's a bunch of women who do that. So there's like a lot of examples of like not just, there's a lot of non-passive females and or like more active, I guess, women in the book. But it was like really around like the romance where I noticed more of a like return to like tradition, if that makes sense.
I agree. And I thought it was interesting how at the beginning, when Galen arrives like all injured and he's weak and Hester is tending to him, that seemed like a kind of purposeful like reversal of the like male female energy. Like he's the one who can't get out of bed, she's ordering him around, like you know, she's the one who's like kind of telling him like, no, you can't like get up and like go to the like privy or whatever it's called, you know. And then that just, I thought that was like an interesting way to start, and then it just kind of like switched as over the course of the book as soon as he was like, you know, healed and not like incapable of getting out of bed.
Yeah, you know, I think that's you're like, I didn't actually think, Elizabeth, what you're saying about that's this total role reversal there. But one thing I did think was interesting, despite him, you know, forcing her to marry him, and despite the what like we've deemed sort of this creepiness, is that he never once said to her like, I want you. He was upset when she put herself in danger, but besides that, he never was like, I want you to stop doing this work on the Underground Railroad. And that, I guess, seemed like sort of different than what you might expect, where these were a man and a woman to get married, and he's like, you now you have to be a wife. And that was I think they set that up interestingly with that whole wife mistress thing that they had going on, where she was both, and so that allowed her to be all the things. And I think that was sort of an interesting construct. But the other thing I wanted to know is if there were any other relationships, like male or female, that were interesting to you at all. or just even like difference. Like I guess I'm struck by like Janine and Foster and how different that was, but also it seems a little bit like you have Janine as being this, like, is it like evil versus, as far as women and romance and that, like Janine is this sort of evil force in that direction. And then you have Hester with this purity. And I thought it was just interesting that like that is something that shows up so much in books where it's like the good woman, bad woman. And it's sort of an interesting dynamic.
It did strike me that Foster was so quick to accept that Janine was too shy to share his bed. It's like, dude, really? Okay. But that's the only other really like couple I think that we see. A lot of the women seem to be independent.
Yeah.
I think there are a lot of like traditional gender norms kind of like underpinning this book, because like Janine's part of, I think what makes her like such a traitor is like also the like betrayal of Foster, and like the way that like the marriage was purely like she tricked Foster right into marrying her for love, even though she didn't really love him. Like that was like the bigger reveal, even more so I think than maybe her just having an affair, or like it felt that way to me. Like and as far as like Galen goes, I feel like that it's that like idea, that romantic idea of like a, he feels very much like a patriarchal ideal in a way, right? Like where you're both protective and loving, where like you don't need to control your partner because like the thing that they are you love. Because there were like definitely things about that relation, we already talked about this, but there were definitely like a couple things that seemed like modern relationship red flags, where I was like, I was thinking about whether or not it was something I would like. I don't know that I would necessarily like point a young reader at this book. Like there are other romances that are probably more modern that like navigate relationship waters a little bit differently. But yeah, Janine, I think was also, I liked that Janine was ultimately the villain. Like I actually did like that.
Yeah.
A lot. Or like one of the villains, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I think it's interesting too. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, I guess since it's a romance, you just can't get away from how the ways that like gender roles kind of like interact with the characters and like their situation in a way.
Yeah. I didn't really think about this, like this romantic relationship, until I was like coming up with the questions for this, but then I was thinking about, because we don't see them as a couple, but it's the genesis for this book is Hester's parents. And that to me was really interesting. And I think like if you just read, here's this man who sold himself into slavery to be able to marry the woman he loves. And that really struck me. And when I first read it, I was like, really? But then, you know, you start to learn that is actually what happened. And what she based this book on, I think, or what gave her the idea. And I don't really think I have a question there, but I was just thinking about their relationship, and I was thinking about like the love versus freedom, and how that, you know, there's a little bit of that in here. And then I guess one thing I could say is that like I think it's interesting that Beverly Jenkins had to put this, like how she had to support her historical findings. I don't know, like, you know, she has this bibliography in the end, and I think that that's great. I also think it's interesting that it's almost like she knew that she was going to be asked to prove these things. And I was wondering, like, I don't read a lot, I've not read a lot of historical romance, but I didn't know if that was like something particular for her, being this groundbreaking person in the 90s and writing this, you know, like people aren't going to believe that the characters in this book would have done some of the things they did. And I guess I didn't know if anyone had thoughts about that, like having the bibliography, but also if this book led you to seek outside information or to confirm anything you'd read, or just to learn more, I guess.
Well,
I have seen it before in romances,
Okay,
in historical romances, not maybe to this extent, but I have seen it before when they talk about something maybe not as well known in history, or that they know that people are going to raise objections to. They will say in like, yeah, in an end, like she did, like,
yeah,
see, ha, and if you want to learn more, you know, go read this. So I have seen it before.
I was going to say that I have too, on occasion, often in books that are like more like, again, I haven't read a ton of romance, but I think the ones I have read tend to be more like this, with a lot of historical information as well, because that's what kind of interested me. And I have seen it at least twice that I can think of, where there's like a bibliography, I guess what you should call it. So for like more information, I guess. I don't know, but I don't know. I thought it's interesting. I was just flipping back here. It said like, it seemed to me that Beverly Jenkins, because she says, I'll just read this. It says, if you would like more information, please look for the books I've cited below in your bookstore at your local library. Remember, knowledge is power, but shared knowledge empowers us all. I almost wonder if she's sharing these because she felt like these were kind of like the best information that she found, and like it's almost her recommendations, like if you want more information, like please seek out, like she says, these books, not like any books, you know. So I thought that was interesting phrasing, that like it's almost like her curated list in a way of like what she's suggesting, which to me is actually really cool. I like that, not just like, hey, these are the references I used, more like, you know, these are what I would recommend.
Along those lines, the Before the Mayflower book is the book that was the book that the woman who did the 1619 project like read, that planted that idea in her brain. So just a fun little connection there. But yeah, just a fun, just a connection I had noticed.
And that just occurred to me what Elizabeth was saying. It was 1996, so you wouldn't have been able to go onto Google and do your own research. You would have had to have gone to your local library. So maybe she was providing this as like a launching off point, so that people could go to their library and say, can you find me these things? Can you find me things similar?
that's a really good point. And I think that goes back to like the initial question of reading a historical fiction and thinking about when it was written versus when you're reading it, and how easy it is to apply, like, or to slip into that, like your own current mindset and forget about the fact that it was being written in 1996. I also think, like what you were saying, Elizabeth, that it's interesting to think about, maybe is she wanted people to get the best sources, because I felt that Beverly Jenkins, I felt, was really good at sort of the minutia, like these little details in history that you might not get anywhere else. I'm thinking of like even I mean, I think I've seen it in other places, but just including like the hush puppies being like, you know, and I didn't know if there were any like little things that really were interesting to people. We've talked about some of the big historical things.
Well, I guess I have to say this isn't little, maybe, but and this is probably just my ignorance, but I learned something right off the bat, that enslaved people who worked with Indigo, it permanently dyed them. And I did not know that at all. That was totally information to me. So like, I just was thinking about that the whole book. I had no idea. And like, what like kind of horrible thing that every day when you look at, like, even though Hester was free, like that's never going to be something that, you know, you don't see. And so I just thought that was right away super interesting, and something that I learned.
Yeah, I did not know that either. And that actually led me to look a little bit more about like the indigo trade, and I didn't realize how big that was also in slavery. And I just think it like this book pointed out to me, you can look at smaller things like that indigo hands and feet, and realize like there are big parts of this history that I feel are not being discussed and not being taught. So I agree, Elizabeth, I didn't know about the indigo and that sort of permanent marking.
I think one of the things I learned about was the I can't remember now what it's called, but the people who bought things that were produced in non
Free produce. Yeah, I
free
didn't know about
produce.
that
I thought
either.
that was
Yeah.
super interesting, and I think especially just in the context of that idea of like how do you navigate a society that like has made these like morally questionable choices way down the line before they even get to you, and like how do you interact with that, like because that's part of what drives some people's buying decisions now. So like it was interesting to see that show up in this book set like 200 years ago basically.
Yeah, and going off of that, like when I was reading it and they talk about putting like honey or maple in their coffee and tea, I didn't think that was strange because people have been doing that for, as far as I know, forever, but apparently not. And I wondered if that was where this originated. This was where putting maple and honey in your drinks became popular, because I know people that drink honey and put maple in their coffee, and that's a big thing right now too. So yeah, I had that thought of like, oh, is that where that originated? That's really cool.
Yeah, the free produce, like learning about that, it did seem very connected to today. Like you're saying, Audrey, that people do make a lot of decisions, and there's a lot of talk now about how things are produced and where they're produced and what labor is used to make them. And I appreciated the way that was entered into this book as just by using the maple syrup first. It wasn't like, let me tell you about this free produce movement. There wasn't a lot of like info dumping. I feel like it was very organically mixed into the story. And then you just see Galen throughout, like, now this is what he does. And I appreciated the way those details, like there was this thread throughout that that was there. And what was I had a question, but was there anything that surprised you in reading this? Like it surprised you about that you didn't expect or that you got out of it?
Well, I wanted to say I enjoyed it. I was a little daunted to start because, as I've said ad nauseum now, I'm not a huge romance reader. I don't have anything against them. I don't find myself super motivated to read them. So I just was pleasantly surprised, really, with I thought, the romance was romance, and we talked about the tropes already, so I won't go into them. But it was, fine. And I think for someone who really enjoys romance, I thought the scenes were, like plenty sexy or whatever you're, looking for in that. And like the characters were really well written, and I was just really happy to have had that experience because I've heard so much about Beverly Jenkins, and I know that she's such an icon, especially as Lucy was saying earlier, in like writing romances with people of color. And I was just like really honestly just like happy, like this is a good book, like, for like, so way to go, like Beverly Jenkins. And I just I did learn some things, and I thought it was, I guess I was pleasantly surprised based on my previous views of like a romance novel. So
yeah, I'm gonna like basically second everything Elizabeth said, because I kind of had the same experience. I don't read a lot of romance. I do sometimes, but not a ton. And like I guess I just didn't know what to expect, but it was like well written, and like we've said, like the history was really well integrated. So I feel like it was like interesting to see it from like this other angle that also like centered like these characters that we don't usually see as like protagonists and this sort of thing. in a way that was very like interesting. Like I noticed in a lot of the like, especially in a lot of the like steamy scenes, she would mention like she would explicitly, there would explicitly be a mention of like the character's like skin color, which I thought was really interesting. So it was like a very, I think there was like a conscious choice to really like center the fact that these characters were not white. And I appreciated that and thought that she did it like she just did a really good job all around. And it's always a pleasure to read like a well-written book, especially one that you might not pick up yourself. So
I do read a fair amount of romances. I wouldn't say I read a lot because I read basically everything. I also write romance, but modern, not historical. So I'm always kind of surprised and pleased. I guess I shouldn't be surprised, but how a lot of the female characters, especially in this case Hester, is a strong, independent woman. Like she would have been just fine on her own. She'd been living on her own, you know, doing the work, and didn't really need Galen. He was just kind of something that enhanced her life and made her happy. And then all of the historical details were like, I really did learn things, and I didn't feel like it was forced on me. It was part of the background. It was part of the environment that these people lived in. And I don't typically associate learning with romances, I guess. It's usually kind of an escape. And this was definitely an escape because they're just such a great couple, but I was also learning. I was learning about them. I was learning about their lives, their environment, what the world was like, what this area was like, because they literally walk the same streets that I do. So that was surprised and pleased me how much there was. It wasn't just a fluffy romance. And she did put in work to write this book. She did research, and it shows. And that was really nice.
Yeah, I agree with that. It's kind of like getting this, it's like it's a history class, but you're not going to be tested or quizzed, and you enjoy this romance along the way. And I think like for me personally, it also led me to there's parts of the story that I want to know more of. I was really interested in Galen's background and the free Black people in Louisiana. I didn't know about that. And so I don't know if she's written books about that, but I kind of personally want to like find other, stories where some of this is explained. Because I also thought there were some things that popped up there that we've seen in other books that we've read in this series, like, the issues of colorism, and the idea of like passing was kind of interesting. And I don't know if that struck anyone, like the different ways that people talked about passing in this book or used passing. Or not.
I'm trying to remember when it happened, because I feel like one thing that was really interesting about this book was a lot of the character, like a lot of it felt like almost like a Black society, because like a lot of the people from the town were either like escaped slaves or refugees or escaped enslaved people. And so like, and then obviously like Galen's high society people were like from this group of like free Louisiana folks. So like I think I assumed a lot of the characters were Black, and kind of filled things in that way in my brain. So I didn't notice, this book didn't seem to have a lot of strong like color lines, I guess is a way to put it, that were like, don't cross here in a way, like,
Yeah, I thought it was interesting I think because like Galen, it was something that he could use tactically, like
yes.
he would
That's right.
pass as white to like further abolitionist efforts, or I think he says he can, because of his like wealth and where he comes from, he can sort of bypass restrictions that other Black people might face where he is in the North, and that he was kind of liked doing that as a almost as a rebellion against those rules, you know. So I thought that that was interesting, like that, the tactical aspect of it. And then you have, I felt like Janine was the person who constantly was talking about like a traitor to the race and why does the race matter, and if you could pass, why wouldn't you? And I was just interested that that was such a focus for her, I felt.
And it sounded like there were a few people that could have, like Galen's aunt, is it Racine, had blue eyes.
Mhm.
And I think Vada had blue eyes also. But they didn't, they identified as Black, even though maybe Vada would have chosen not to. We don't really see much of her. But I did, yeah, I forgot about that when Galen was saying he had posed as like Italian. And I kind of laughed a little bit because my mom's family is Sicilian, and I have some very dark cousins. That, yeah, if we were next to each other, you probably would never guess we were related. It's just kind of on that side of the family, it's just all different shades. So when he said Italian, I was like, that's a good choice.
Yeah, it was just, yeah, so just more of those little details that I appreciated in this book that that caused me to learn things that I just without being hit over the head with it, just sort of there. So I don't know if anyone reads a lot of has read historical romance, but do you think that after reading this book, it is something that you would be interested in reading more of?
I would be interested in reading at least one more Beverly Jenkins, just because I'm curious, perhaps set in a different time period, to see if it's as good in my mind as this, and to see, like, you know, if this, just because I did enjoy this and I would be interested in that. You know, and I don't think, like, I never say no to a book if it looks good to me. I don't know if I'm going to start like placing holds on, you know, every historical romance in the collection, but I am interested in checking out at least one more Beverly Jenkins, just to, you know, feel like I've, you know, I would like to know her writing a little bit better now that I've read this.
Yeah, I wouldn't say that I would like run out and read more, but like I wouldn't be mad about it. And like you're saying, Elizabeth, like you just never know what mood you're going to be in the future, where like one day, like now it's in my brain, so maybe one day the day will come where I'm like, you know what I want today? Historical romance. And I'm not going to be like, no.
A lot of the historical romance I have read, it doesn't take place in America. Because a lot of it that I find tends to be about like Southern belles and like the Western frontier, and I'm just not interested in those, especially because they're usually tropey and not very historical. So this would make me look more into like, oh, well, maybe there are some American historical romances that might be worth it, or from a perspective that I would appreciate more than like a rich Southern white lady.
Yeah, I think I agree with that. Like I felt that I appreciated that the viewpoint that this book took, and I definitely do want to read more Beverly Jenkins. I think the more I sit with this book, the more I realize like how I thought it was really immersive, and I just kind of enjoyed like really getting into that world. And I know that when I'm reading or I'm looking for something to read, there are certain times where I'm certainly like craving that sort of experience of being just totally pulled into a world. So I think I might turn to Beverly Jenkins for some of that. But we are about at an hour, so if anyone has any last thoughts about Indigo or other historical fiction or romance.
Oh, I just wanted to mention that I was at Carytown Book Fest this weekend, and she was speaking. Unfortunately, I couldn't stay for that. But the Blackstone bookstore had all of her books set out on the table, but they didn't have Indigo. And so I was talking with Kip, one of the owners who was behind the table, about the book, and he immediately like brought up his phone. He's like, wait, which one is that? We don't have that in the store. I'm going to order that right now. I'm going to read that. And just for me telling him like the elements that I could, and he was utterly fascinated by it and was really excited about the book. So if you're looking to buy it, Blackstone hopefully will have it soon.
That's really great to hear. That's really good timing, you know, on your part to be in that place at that time. Well, the next discussion we are going to have is On the Street by Anne Petrie, and that is also something that was written, I think, in the 1950s, but I could be not exactly right about that. And so that should also be interesting. But thank you three for discussing this with me today. I think it was a lot of fun, and I'm glad I got to read it.
Yeah, thanks everybody. I enjoyed the discussion.
Yeah, me too. It was a good book.
Yeah, thank you.